further ado, I am going to turn to you, Professor Mearsheimer, for the first question. So, over the past 48 hours, the US has proposed a 15-point plan calling on Iran to dismantle key parts of its nuclear program, transfer highly enriched uranium to the IAEA, and it's called for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for lifting sanctions. Iran has, on the surface at least, rejected this plan and has issued its own 5-point counterproposal, demanding a halt to all aggression and assassinations, war reparations, guarantees against future attacks, and also full recognition of its authority over the Strait of Hormuz. And now we've also been seeing that despite these sort of exchanges of these plans through intermediaries like Pakistan and Turkey, the US continues to deploy thousands of additional troops and Marines to the region, the 82nd Airborne, military or Marine expeditionary units. How do you interpret this mix of diplomacy with a military buildup?
Well, when I first saw the 15-point plan, I thought it was a joke. I said, this can't be serious. I think the demands are uh, more harsh than the pre-war demands were. There's no way the Iranians would ever accept these demands that the Americans are putting forward. What the Americans don't seem to understand is that the Iranians are in the driver's seat here. They're winning the war. They hold a handful of excellent cards. First of all, they have the ability to wreck the international economy. That gives them tremendous leverage. They have the ability to wreck, I mean, wreck the Gulf states. They have the ability to do enormous damage to Israel. And with regard to a ground invasion, I want to see a couple thousand American troops invade Iran and get anywhere. This is not a serious argument. Uh, and on top of all that, the Americans are letting Iranian oil tankers go through the Strait of Hormuz, and they've lifted sanctions on Iranian oil. Why? Because it's imperative that we get as much oil out into the global market as possible. So the Iranians are making lots of money at the same time they hold all these cards. And then the Americans come along and issue these bizarre demands. And is anybody surprised that the Iranians rejected them? I mean, I really sometimes wonder if the Americans are playing with a full deck here.
Absolutely. And well, it's interesting because we see sort of divergent objectives when it comes to the US and Israel. Just last week, Joe Kent, who was Trump's own director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned in protest, as we all know. He said that there was no imminent threat to our nation. And in his words, this war was started due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. Do you believe this to be true? And given this assertion, when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to this military buildup, who do you really think is in the driving seat between Israel and the US? Which of the two is ultimately going to determine the trajectory of this war from their side? I mean, of course, Iran is in the driving seat at its own end, but between Israel and the US, who is really going to determine the trajectory?
I think there's no question that eventually the Americans will drive the train. And the reason is that the greatest threat we face is that the international economy is going to crash. I mean, people can focus on the military dimensions of this crisis, and it's very interesting and it's important. But the key here is we're in danger of crashing the international economy. There's a giant iceberg out there in the water, and we're headed right for it. There's all sorts of evidence of that. And it is going to be President Trump's responsibility to make sure we don't hit that iceberg. Or let me put it differently, to try to make sure we don't hit that iceberg. It might be too late, but he's not going to care in the end what the Israelis think, in large part because the stakes here are so enormous. Now, with regard to your question of what got us into this war, I'll make a couple points. First of all, I think it's clearly Israel and the lobby. It's important to understand, this would be my second point, that I think the deep state in the United States was basically against this operation. I think if you look at what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was saying, what the Pentagon was saying, what the National Intelligence Council was saying, what people in the intelligence community in general were saying, this was an operation that didn't make any sense. And anybody who has any understanding of military history understands that what we set out to do stood virtually no chance of succeeding. And of course, it hasn't succeeded. But how did we get into this? Well, the Mossad played a very key role in convincing both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump that what was going to happen here is if we launched a shock and awe campaign, the regime in Iran would quickly collapse and we would win a quick and decisive victory. And President Trump thought that that's exactly what would happen because David Barnea, who is the head of Mossad, convinced him of that. And of course, he convinced Netanyahu of that as well. But it didn't happen, and we're now in a war of attrition. And as I said a few minutes ago, in a war of attrition, the Iranians hold almost all the cards. Uh, they have the ability to cause enormous damage in the international system, which is clearly not to our advantage. So Israel and the lobby once again got us into a war, much as they did in the case of Iraq. But in this case, the consequences are far more scary.
And just one last follow-up question, Professor Mearsheimer. You said that it's the responsibility of the US or Trump to get us out of this, and that would probably happen through negotiations. As we're seeing that there is, again, Trump right before this webinar also announced that, he's giving 10 more days before he starts striking Iranian power plants and energy sites, etc., because talks are ongoing. Now, in terms of the talks and whatever level or whatever stage they're at, do you believe that Israel has will actively try and sabotage them, either by targeting Iranian negotiators or even their interlocutors? Do you believe that that could actually happen?
I think the Israelis will probably try to sabotage the talks. But the point I'm trying to make is that I don't think the Israelis will be able to do that because the imperative for Trump to settle this is so great. And what's going to happen here is he's going to go to great lengths to try to settle it. And the problem that he faces is twofold. First of all, the demands on both sides are light years apart. There's simply no bargaining space here at this point in time. The second problem is if you're the Iranians, if I'm playing the Iranian hand, to put it in slightly different terms, I don't negotiate, right? I want this war to go on because the longer the war goes on, the more leverage I have and the more I get in the final agreement when it ultimately comes. And this is the problem that President Trump faces. There is an iceberg out there, and we are heading towards it. And what he has to do is he has to change the direction that the Titanic is going. And the question you have to ask yourself is, can he do that reasonably quickly? And it has to be reasonably quickly. And what I'm saying to you is, I think the Iranians have a vested interest in not allowing him to move the ship so it doesn't hit the iceberg, because the Iranians are playing a powerful hand and they have a deep-seated interest in maximizing their coercive leverage over these two existential threats that they face, one Israel and the other the United States.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer. Trita, let me turn to you. I would like for you to respond to Professor Mearsheimer's perspective on this. And of course, we have the same question for you as well. How do you interpret these mixed signals in terms of the military buildup and also simultaneous talks that are allegedly happening? But I also want to ask you a couple of other things sort of attached to that. It's clear that Iran is not quite ready to negotiate. And among other things that it has sort of stated in terms of, conditions for a ceasefire or conditions for negotiations is the fact that it should never be attacked in the same way again by Israel and the US. But given the leverage, the significant leverage that Iran has demonstrated since this war began through its control over the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting roughly 20% of global oil shipments, 30% of global fertilizers and other supply chain disruptions, combined with the fact that it's still continuing to strike across the region. Do you think that Tehran has already established a meaningful level of deterrence against future US attacks?
Thank you so much. And it's great to be with you. And as always, amazing to be with John here. I find myself in quite strong agreement with almost everything John said. So, not sure if I can add much to some of the earlier comments. Let me just say a couple of things about the diplomacy. One area where I may differ a little bit, I don't think the Iranians want to drag this out endlessly. I think the Israelis do. I think from the Iranian standpoint, they do recognize that they have managed to gain a tremendous amount of leverage and that they are now in a strong position. They really have Trump in a terrible position because Trump himself put him there by listening to the Israelis. But they also must recognize that they need to essentially translate this leverage into a new stable order. And there is a lot of risk associated by allowing the war to go on for too long. Not in the sense that I see any significant weaknesses on their side quite yet. In fact, I think the Iranian government is in a much, much stronger position internally. And that will probably last as long as the war lasts. After the war, there may be some challenges for it. And that may be one of those incentives for it not to end it too quickly. But it's going to have to translate this some way, somehow into a more stable position. And that ultimately will happen through a negotiation. Now, if that negotiation starts too late, and this is my own analysis, I don't know if the Iranians see it this way, and Trump essentially has crossed the Rubicon, he will no longer be able to create a narrative of victory that is convincing to his own base. Again, to his own base. No one else outside of it buys it for a second, obviously. But if when you take a look at the polling of his own base, and at Quincy we have done some polling of only Trump voters, he still has about 76% support, at least as of last week. Now, they would be very happy to see him just declare victory and end it. 79% want him to declare victory and leave it. But if he, for instance, goes in with ground troops over the weekend, I think he will have crossed the Rubicon and it will be a bloodbath. And the support level that he still has, which is largely because they're just loyal to Trump and because they watch Fox News. And if you watch Fox News, you had no idea what's going on in the real world, at least when it comes to this war. So they're just profoundly misinformed. But once you have a bloodbath and a large number of American soldiers are coming home in coffins, I think that will have a profound impact. And once Trump loses the ability to have a narrative of victory that enables him to take an off-ramp, I think his incentive structures may change. It is the rational thing to just cut loose of this loss, get out, get some sort of a deal, and make the best of it. But we have seen plenty of American presidents having that option and not doing it. For 20 years, we were constantly told victory is just 6 months around the corner in Afghanistan. And 20 years later, the United States has spent $2 trillion changing the government of Afghanistan from the Taliban back to the Taliban. Now, this one is different, and John put his finger on it because of the manner in which the Iranians can really, really squeeze the global economy. But there's also a limit there. I'm not saying that they don't have a longer term ability to do so, but it's not an infinite level because this is already starting to create a lot of problems for China. I've spoken with the Chinese and they're quite worried. They're not as insulated in terms of gas prices and oil shocks as the US is actually. If you walk around in the United States anywhere right now, you would have no idea that we just started a war against a country of 90 million. But if you walk in India or in Bangladesh or in some of those countries in Asia, you would absolutely know it because a lot of offices have actually closed and they're only allowing their people to work from home because they have to save fuel. Part of the reason Pakistan has been very eager to mediate is because they were essentially 2 or 3 days away from having no reserves left. India is about 10 days away from that. once you reach those red lines and once it goes to countries like China, etc., then I think the Iranians are also going to face a challenge of a lot of anger from those countries. Now, they may come in and try to force an agreement that is not one-sided in favor of the US, obviously. But I'm just saying that they also have to be a little bit careful not to take this too far. And one lesson they should keep in mind, last time Iran humiliated the United States was in 1979 till 81 with the hostage crisis.
Mhm.
That led to 47 years of enmity, sanctions, and eventually war. I think it would be wise of them to make sure that they use their leverage to never get attacked again. That's totally rational. But I don't think it would be wise of them to go as far as seeking the humiliation of Trump or the United States, because I think a lot of bad things will come out of that, that ultimately will be bad for the Iranians as well, even though they may end up having been a victor in this war. They should be careful not to turn this victory into a Pyrrhic victory, essentially.
Sure. And do you believe that, and I know you said this is your perspective, not the Iranian government's necessarily, but do you think that they might see this sort of imminent or impending ground invasion as sort of a deadline for themselves? Because if they go beyond that, then that will take away Trump's victory narrative.
I think they're both worried about it, and I have had conversations with people around the government there throughout this war.
Hmm.
I think they're worried about that scenario, but not because they think that they will lose it. I mean, for instance, some of these islands, the US actually can relatively easy take the islands. The problem is that once you're on an island, you're not going anywhere, you're static.
Hmm.
And the Iranians will rain down missiles and drones from a very short distance, and the United States will have very little ability to protect itself. So it will be a massive loss of life for the United States. And even if at the end of the day they keep the island, so what? I
Yeah.
mean, what is the strategic difference this makes? I
Right.
mean, we have this phenomenon in the United States. We haven't quite used it in quite yet. I guess the administration may do so if it decides to actually take one of these islands, in which we're selling this idea that this one specific piece of land, the Donbass, who controls the Donbass will determine the future of the United States. No, it will not. Nor did any particular hill in Afghanistan that a lot of American Marines died for make the slightest difference. And the same thing is here with some of these islands. Now, some of them are very important to the Iranians, undoubtedly. But the US controlling them does not necessarily change the game in any particular way. So I've been really confused by this. To me, it only signals the degree of desperation Trump is in, that he's just searching for something, some sort of a silver bullet that will turn this war around. And I don't think there is one. And I hope that he comes to that conclusion before testing that proposition.
But it would be good to know who he's listening to when it comes to this
Oh,
ground.
we know that.
I mean, yes. So, well, Israel, you think that Israel is pushing for that ground invasion? Because 5,000 troops perhaps is not enough for an invasion of mainland Iran. Yes, for that island perhaps, but even at least publicly, Israeli officials have come out to say, just like the Gulf countries have, that no, we don't think this is a good idea. That invasion, ground invasion, even if it's just limited to the islands, is not a great idea. Why is he doing that?
So I think, again, he's desperately searching for a silver bullet to turn
Hmm.
this around. And he knows that time is not on his side because at some point, those higher oil prices will lead to not just higher oil fuel prices, but also to higher food prices because of fertilizers, etc. And that will really be felt primarily by his own base rather than other Americans. And
Sure.
once that turns around and they actually actively push against him on this war, then he's going to be in a very bad position. So he's just desperately trying to find something. From the Israeli side, yes, I think they know that this is a bad idea amongst all of the other bad idea that he's looking at, but it's very crucial for them to keep the United States in this war. They have fought for more than 25 years to get the United States to go to war with Iran. They don't want this to end, in their view, as they call it, prematurely. They want to make sure that the United States uses as much firepower as possible together with Israel to destroy Iran's industrial base, set it back decades, to make sure that the Iranians cannot challenge Israel's designs for domination in the region. So it's not about thinking that necessarily if there's a change of regime, everything will be fine. They just want to make sure that the Iranians don't have the capability. That's the most important thing. And if they can keep it going for a couple of more months or weeks, yes, it would be a huge strategic loss for the United States. But the Israelis will still see it as a significant victory for them, because if Iran has been set back 5 decades, that is at least 48 more years than what the Israelis themselves could have done alone.
Absolutely. And just one last question before we turn to Professor Mearsheimer about this. Now, suppose that Iran, as Professor Mearsheimer said, it's in a very good position. We don't want it to overextend, but suppose it decides it does not want negotiations at this point and things continue the way they are. So Iran continues to strike missiles across the region, and continues to control the Strait of Hormuz. But in response, of course, is going to be pounded by Israel and the United States. How much pain do you believe the Iranian government and the Iranian people are willing to take before their strategic calculus changes? And they decide to go ahead with negotiations.
Are you asking me or Trita?
Well, that was for Trita.
I'm so sorry. I thought it was for John. My apologies.
Sorry, this is for you, and then we will turn to Professor Mearsheimer.
Yeah. Look, after the June war, the Iranians prepared themselves, and we spoke after that. The Iranians prepared themselves for the next war, essentially assuming that it was more or less inevitable. I think it's quite clear by now that they actually did a better job preparing themselves for that than the Israelis or the US did.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the beginning of this war, they thought that they could withstand this for 3 to 6 months. My understanding now is that they actually think that they can withstand this longer. To a certain extent, they expected a more successful onslaught of attacks from the US and Israel. I'm not saying that they were underwhelmed, because clearly the US has used a tremendous amount of firepower, killed a lot of their leaders, etc. But I think they may have actually outperformed their own expectations, and particularly when it comes to the manner in which they're controlling the Strait of Hormuz. And John mentioned something very important. They're making more money. Let me just give a bit detail to that. Prior to the war, they were selling oil about 1.1 million barrels, a little bit less than that. And they were selling it at $65, but with an $18 discount because of the sanctions. So essentially at $47 a barrel. As of 3 days ago, they were selling 1.5 million barrels at $110 with a $2 to $4 discount. And they actually can sell more if they had the capacity, but because there's been so much sanctions on their program, their ability to, the capacity of their oil industry is not what it used to be. But bottom line is the war has actually turned into de facto sanctions relief for Iran. All of this has added to their ability to actually withstand this further. Moreover, I think they're also perhaps slightly surprised to see that the Israelis already are running out of arrow missiles. Obviously, they would not have the knowledge of knowing exactly how fast the US can replenish the Israeli stockpiles of interceptors, etc. But it seems like the Israelis are already running out of it. And some warnings have been said that already by early April, they will be out. So all of those things, I think the Iranians are sitting pretty tight. And this is precisely why Trump is looking for that one move, that silver bullet that turns the table. And I think a land invasion, doesn't matter which island he goes for, is probably going to do the opposite. He's going to dig himself into a much, much deeper hole.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned that the Israelis are running out. I think there was a Washington Post report just this morning saying that the US might be running out of critical munitions, and it might be sort of taking stuff away from Ukraine to now focus on the Middle East.
And to just add one point, and the Houthis are not in the war yet.
And exactly, that is going to be my next question to you, Trita. But I'd like to turn to Professor Mearsheimer. If you'd like to respond to anything that Trita said, please do so. My next question to you is about the Gulf. Would you like to respond before I go on?
Yeah, let me just say just a word or two. And this is mainly a response to you, Melekwa. You're talking about going up the escalation ladder and asking the question, how much pain can the Iranians absorb? But that question assumes that the Iranians just sit there and take it. In other words, you go up the escalation ladder And it's only us going up the escalation ladder and whacking Iran. They have all sorts of options. If you start inflicting significant pain on the Iranians, they're going to inflict significant pain on the Gulf states. They can basically destroy countries like Saudi Arabia as functioning societies. Given that uh, there are these few desalination plants that exist in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait and other Gulf states, and given that their uh, energy infrastructure presents a target-rich environment, you start going up the escalation ladder. The Iranians can do all sorts of things. The same thing is true with taking one of these little islands in the strait. Okay, you take that island and it looks like you're going to open up the strait. All the Iranians have to do is lay mines. Anybody who knows anything about naval warfare knows that anytime you drive ships near mines, oh my God, right? This is really dangerous. And the Iranians have the capability to lay down huge numbers of mines. And furthermore, if the mines don't work and we break through the strait, then we're into the Persian Gulf. Good luck with that. All those cruise missiles, drones, ballistic missiles they have available to aim at those ships that will be like sitting ducks in the Gulf. I mean, it's the point I would make to you is it's impossible to tell a story about how we, meaning the tag team here, the United States and the Israelis, how the tag team prevails.
Right.
And I've asked all sorts of people, please tell me how the tag team prevails. And I ask people who are joined at the hip with the tag team, and they have no plausible story to tell. Is Treat is right that you hear a plausible story or two, you hear an implausible story or two on Fox News, but really, does that matter? Uh, Another whole dimension to this is the nuclear weapons dimension. Where does this one end up? You killed Ayatollah Khamenei on February 28th, and it's quite clear that he was probably the principal opposition inside of Iran to developing a bomb. He's now dead, and he's been replaced by someone who's much more sympathetic to that idea. And furthermore, given that you've had this war, isn't the message clear that Iran should have had a bomb beforehand? You can make an argument against that, but you can also make a much more powerful argument that Iran is going to get a bomb now than you could make before the war started. And if you really sort of think about where we are today compared to where we would be if we had accepted the deal before February 28th that was being negotiated, or if we had just stuck to the JCPOA. I mean, the contrast between where we are and where we could be is like the difference between night and day. And it just shows you what a fundamentally flawed decision President Trump made on February 28th. It's just hard to believe he did this. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that inside the deep state, there were all sorts of people who were saying this is not a good idea. And furthermore, again, anybody who's familiar with the historical record on regime change with air power alone knows that this is a non-starter. It just doesn't work. So when you think about where we are, oh, it's hard to believe.
Not a pretty picture at all. But I just want to shift. We'll come back to this, Professor Mearsheimer, but I just did want to sort of shift gears and sort of focus on the Gulf a little bit. At the beginning of the war, we saw mixed signals from key Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Publicly, they voiced opposition to this misadventure, yet multiple reports now suggest that they had been behind the scenes pushing for this. And now, following Iran's recent attacks on their critical gas and energy infrastructure, they have hinted, in fact, they have actively said that they will join the war against Tehran. And I think it was the UAE ambassador to the US who just said this morning that a ceasefire is not enough and actually pushed the US for a, quote, conclusive outcome against Iran. What do you believe the Gulf states are thinking at this point, especially the key ones like Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Qatar has, of course, said that it wants out. It's not going to be party to this conflict at all. But the other GCC countries, they did issue a joint communique or a statement today, sort of condemning Iran's aggression. How do you see them going forward? They have this powerful neighbor in Iran that's not going anywhere. And yet they somehow seem to be relying on the US and Israel for security guarantees to get them out of this mess, when both those countries have betrayed them by not including them in the planning for this war.
Well, I would start by saying that anybody who has taken Strategy 101 understands that the Gulf states would be out of their mind to pick a war with Iran. And that what they should be doing is doing everything they can to make sure that Iran doesn't target their desalination plants and their energy infrastructure. As I said before, it's very important to understand that the Iranians have enough short-range ballistic missiles and enough drones that they can effectively destroy most of those states in the Gulf. And I think the Gulf states do not want to give Iran any incentive to do that. And they should understand that the United States and Israel have dragged them into a war that might lead to their destruction. Now, what is actually happening? You do read in the paper that the Saudis and the UAE are putting pressure on the United States and Israel to finish the job, to go in full bore and knock off Iran. I don't understand how they could possibly have come to the conclusion that that is feasible. Maybe they're watching Fox News. I don't know. But that's just not in the cards, right? We're flailing around, as are the Israelis. And I think anybody with 20/20 eyesight should understand that. And they surely have at least a few people who have 20/20 eyesight. So when I hear that they're actually pushing us, the Gulf states are pushing us to finish the job, I say to myself, this is probably a disinformation campaign by the Israelis. I'm not sure that's true, and I'd be very curious to hear what Trita has to say because he's better plugged in than I am. But I find it hard to believe that they want to up the ante here. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But then again, that may be the case.
Sure. Thank you. Trita, would you like to respond?
Sure, sure. I mean, on the logic of it, John is absolutely right. This makes no sense. Unfortunately, some of them are really into not making sense. So what you have right now is Qatar and Oman has essentially struck their own deals with Iran.
Mhm.
There's been about 4 days now with no attacks on them. And the earlier position was that the GCC would have like a unified position. That was just untenable because the Emiratis are on a completely different page. If you listen to what Emirati officials are now publicly saying, if it is an Israeli misinformation campaign, they have full public support from the Emiratis to pursue that because Emirati officials are essentially saying that they're going to stand with the US and Israel in a war with Iran and essentially hinting that if there is an attack against any of these islands, they will be involved. I suspect this is and by the way, let me also say another thing. The Iranians have been sending information, military intelligence to all of the GCC countries, as well as to the UN Secretary General on a daily basis. Intelligence that shows that the US has been using the territory of some of these countries to attack Iran, despite denials from these states. Now, it could be that the US is doing it without their approval, but nevertheless, it is happening. So the idea that they would enter the war and they haven't entered it, many of them have entered it, it's just not openly so. If the Emiratis then go along, and what I think could potentially be what Trump is thinking now, is that there are 3 islands that belong to the Iranians that are contested, that are claimed by the Emiratis, Abu Musa and the Lesser and Greater Toms. And if the US were to go and try to take, particularly Abu Musa, which is very close to the Emirati shoreline,
Mhm.
middle of the strait,
Mhm.
it could be an effort to really kind of undo this very strong impression that has been given in the region, which is the US is only concerned about Israel and is not protecting these states. Trump would essentially say, look, I'm giving your island back to you, and essentially accepting the Emirati narrative. It would put the other GCC states in a tough position because they all take Emirate sides on the island disputes, but not on this larger dispute. And it could put them in a bit of a bind there. But if this were to happen, first of all, I don't see what difference taking Abu Musa does. I'm not saying that it's not a strategically valuable island, but it doesn't change the larger picture. The Iranians don't need Abu Musa to close the straits in the manner that they have. That's one. Secondly, this would then actually take off all constraints on the Iranian side when it comes to how they deal with the UAE. Because so far, as John pointed out, there's a lot more they could do, and they haven't done it because everyone has essentially sustained some of these GCC states' plausible deniability in saying that they're not involved in the war. This would completely take away that plausible deniability, and that enables the Iranians to go at the UAE much harsher. And there really is it's really difficult to see what would be left of Abu Dhabi and Dubai under those circumstances. And this would just completely blow up their business model going forward for decades. And it would be really difficult to see what the end result of that would be for them. So again, it is extremely foolish and unfortunately one of the more likely scenarios.
Trita, can I just make a quick point in addition to everything you said, which I, of course, agree with? It's very important to understand that if Iran slams the UAE, this war breaks out and Iran really goes after the UAE, the United States cannot retaliate in kind against Iran. This is why the United States can't take Kharg Island and shut Kharg Island down, because we need Iranian oil to flow into the global market. You want to understand that we have to get all the oil we can possibly get into
Yeah.
the global market so we don't sink the international economy. This is why we haven't talked about this, we lifted sanctions on Russian oil as well as
And
on
Iranian oil.
Iranian.
And Iranian oil.
And
Yes,
Yes.
and
Iranian.
Iranian oil.
Yeah.
Exactly. And plus we're letting Iranian tankers go through the strait because we just need all the oil we can get. So when people start talking about Kharg Island and going in there and cutting off Iranian oil, you just sort of scratch your head and say, don't you understand that that would have devastating consequences for the world economy? So in a very important way, I think if the Iranians were really to slam the UAE, go after their oil refineries, go after their ports, go after their desalination plants, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the United States to retaliate in kind, because in effect, we would then be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Just to add to what you just said, Trump made those threats against Kharg Island. And then what did he strike? Only the military facilities. He saved the oil pipelines precisely for the very same reason you said. And one of the things that then comes out of all of this, regardless of how this war ultimately ends almost, is that this war has taken off the potency of American military threats against Iran as a point of leverage. In the future, if there is a negotiation on the nuclear front or anything else, what value, what credibility will American military threats against Iran have in that equation? Because the Iranians will know very well the United States is just not going to be dumb enough to do this twice.
Right.
And
I
you
think
take that.
Go ahead. Sorry,
So,
Trita.
and you take that out. I think the Iranians could never have done anything on their own to change the equation as dramatically in their own direction in the manner that Trump now has done.
Yeah. I think the same logic, by the way, applies to the Israelis, right?
Mhm.
And the point I would make is that ballistic missiles and cruise missiles have fundamentally changed the game. When I was young and you used to study the Arab-Israeli wars, it was mainly armies versus armies on the ground, but in the air, it was airplanes versus airplanes. The ballistic
Mhm.
missile threat, and there were no drones at the time, and the ballistic missile threat was largely non-existent. That began to go away at the time of the first Gulf War in 91 with the Scud missiles. You remember that.
Mm,
But over time, what we have seen is the proliferation of very accurate and very deadly ballistic missiles. Look at
mm,
Hezbollah, look at Iran, look at the Houthis, and cruise missiles as well. So the threat environment that Israel faces today is much different than the one it faced in the past, much more dangerous for the Israelis. And excuse me, this, of course, is why they place such a high premium on getting some sort of agreement with Iran that curtails their development, curtails Iran's development of ballistic missiles, because they fully
mm.
understand the nature of that threat.
Well, I
Yes.
wanted to talk about Iran's strategic advantage in that because we keep hearing from administration officials and Israeli officials that Iran's capacity has been degraded considerably since the war began. And yet we saw Iran, and I believe that was confirmed, that it did target Diego Garcia, that island in the Indian Ocean, and in that the range was far beyond what people had expected Iran to have. So my question to you, Trita, is that how much are there other surprises that we do not know about that Iran has the capacity to launch? And that is one side of it, sort of, military capabilities. The other is, again, what it calls the axis of resistance, Hezbollah. Houthis, who have not done anything since this war began across the Red Sea, the Darul Mandab, that strait nobody's talking about, and that is another point of leverage for Iran. Also, the Iran-aligned Iraqi militia. I don't think they have fully participated in this either. So all of that combined, what does that do to deter Israel and the US, and what does it say about Iranian capabilities?
So the US intelligence knew that the Iranians actually had capability of shooting missiles at a longer distance.
Mm.
It was a self-imposed limit that they had essentially done to as a de-escalatory step.
Mhm.
It's the accuracy of their ability to shoot missiles at that length that is unclear. And I don't know if that has changed now because those missiles apparently, one of them fell in the sea, the other one was shot down. Um, so we don't know quite yet exactly how effective they would be at that. But I think it does tell us not necessarily those missiles, but the fact that we now have seen footage coming out of Israel. And there's very little footage coming out of Israel, including out of Dubai, by the way, because you're faced with the threat of prison sentences. If you're actually posting videos that shows the skyline and shows what these missiles are doing. But some videos have come out, and some of those missiles are both capable of changing trajectory and direction mid-air, very close to the surface. And some of the others seem to be so robust so that even two interceptors were not sufficient to either take them down or even change their trajectory. So that has been, and of course, now we've also seen that they have quite a lot and very effectively using these cluster missiles that come in and then they break into clusters. The clusters themselves are not as damaging, of course, as a massive bomb, but nevertheless are creating massive problems. I was speaking to an Israeli journalist today who said that his parents have to go down into the bunkers 9 times a night. Wow. There is this constant. That's obviously going to have some significant psychological impact, although we're not seeing much of a opposition to the war inside of Israel quite yet. But nevertheless, these capabilities are beyond oftentimes what we had heard. It's different from saying that that is beyond what the US or Israel actually assessed. Because what you had is a ridiculous narrative in the media after the June war that said, oh, the Iranians took such a huge beating and those missiles were of no problem for the Israelis because of the military censorship on the Israeli side. And it took some while before more and more stories started to come out that showed that, look, that was actually not the case. They got a lot of those missiles through towards the end of the war. The Israelis were running out of interceptors. The Iranians became more and more effective in using a combination of missile drones and simultaneous cyber attacks to knock out the Israeli anti-air defense systems. But in the beginning, that's not at all what you heard. It was like, as they say, truth is the first victim of war. Going forward, another surprise is, we were told that Hezbollah was completely defanged. It clearly is not. We don't know what the Houthis can or cannot do because they've kept their cards very, very tight. But it does seem to me that that is a deliberate move in order to save them, primarily, probably, as a deterrence against the Saudis entering the war fully, because it would be very problematic situations for the Saudis to have both Iran to deal with and then simultaneously from the back dealing with the Houthis. So I think a lot of rewriting is going to take place after all of this. And we have to also recognize that a lot of the previous false narrative was deliberate to give the impression that this is going to be an easy thing. The Iranian regime is just on the brink of collapse. All you need to do is push it a little bit. Why? Because I think those who were pushing for this war knew very well Trump is not in principle against war or in principle against regime change. He's in principle against things that are difficult, that don't have a fast and guaranteed way towards glory for him. But if you can convince him that this is not difficult, this is very easy, this is going to give you a tremendously, this is going to be Venezuela on crack, and you're going to be the historic president that managed to do this, then you can actually get him to do it, even though, of course, that is completely detached from reality.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We really do want to turn to audience Q&A, but I do have two last questions for each of you. So I'm going to ask Professor Mearsheimer really quickly if you could talk about the Russia role in all of this and the Russians and the Chinese. How are they responding to this, and how do you think they will respond as this conflict evolves?
Well, I think the Russians and the Chinese have been helping the Iranians.
Right.
It's hard to tell from the outside exactly how much help they've been providing. I think the Russians are providing very important intelligence to the Iranians. There's also some talk about different defensive systems and help with drones that the Russians have given to the Iranians. I don't have any hard evidence of that, so I'm not absolutely sure. I think there's no question that China and Russia both have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Iran wins this war. But as Trita pointed out a long time ago in this conversation, at the same time not wrecking the international economy because it's in China as well as Russia's interest not to let that happen. And just very quickly, I think if there's any one winner in this war at this point in time, it's the Russians, because I think that the fact that sanctions have been lifted off their oil and gas is manna from heaven from them. And furthermore, the fact that we are limited now in what kinds of weapons and munitions we can send to Ukraine improves the Russians' chances of winning on the battlefield.
Do you think, Professor Mearsheimer, that Trump might reach out to China, given how it's being affected, how its economy might be affected by this war, to apply pressure on the Iranians?
I would bet my life that he has already reached out to the Chinese and he is begging the Chinese to help him. To go back to Trita's language before, he is desperate. There's no question about this. He is in really deep trouble. I mean, really deep trouble. And he can't find an exit ramp. So I'm sure that he's talked to Putin. I'm sure he's talked to Xi. I think we're asking the Chinese and the Russians to do everything they can to get the Iranians to reach some sort of agreement. And the question is, how effective will that pressure be? Because if you're Iran and you understand you're dealing with an existential threat, and you understand that you're operating in what we realists call a self-help world, and that the Chinese and the Russians cannot ultimately save you if you get into trouble. If you're the Iranians, you have a vested interest in playing hardball for a long time.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Trita, last question to you. How is this war going to impact internal dynamics within Israel, within Iran, and within the US? I'm so sorry for this very long question and asking you to be brief about it, please.
So on the US, let me just quickly say, I think it's going to be really interesting what happens on the MAGA right after this. I think anti-war sentiments there are real. They are at times trumped by loyalty to Trump, but they're not a fantasy. They're part of the reason is because, there's more soldiers coming home in coffins with PTSD, committing suicide without limbs in red states like Arkansas, et cetera, than there are in Brooklyn. So the fact that there's such strong sentiments in red states that tend to be pro-Trump is not a surprise. I think it's going to be a real reckoning there. And I think, as John pointed out earlier on, Israel is going to be at the very center of that debate. And I think it's going to be very, very fascinating. On Iran, I would turn it around a little bit and point to something John said earlier on, what a huge mistake it was from a strategic standpoint for the United States to walk out of the deal in 2015 or in 2018 when Trump walked out of it, the Obama deal, and later on also not agreeing to the deal that was on the table in February. Imagine if the US hadn't done this. You would have had 10 years of sanctions relief. The first 2 years caused the Iranian economy to grow between 6 to 7% in 2 years straight, each year. The Iranian middle class would have grown over the course of those 10 years, probably would have become the strongest, if not one of the strongest middle classes in the region. It would make demands for greater openness, for greater democracy within that Iranian system, but it would do so from a position of strength. Instead, in December and January, we saw those same people out there, but they were now making demands of that kind, but from a position of utter despair and desperation because of the manner that these sanctions had decimated the Iranian middle class. Between 2018 and 19, when Trump first imposed maximum pressure sanctions, Iran's middle class, 1/3 of them went into poverty. You cannot build a democracy under those kind of circumstances. So I think, directly, indirectly, definitely contributed to the direction inside the country going in the wrong direction and in a much more hawkish direction, more closed direction. And after this war, it's going to get even more like that, I fear.
Absolutely. I wish we could go on with this conversation, but we do want to turn to our audience. We have almost 200 of them here, and there are lots and lots of questions. So what I will now do is invite our board member, Roxanne Bruno, to sort of ask the first.
Thank you. Hi. There are so many excellent questions, and this is a combination of pieces and parts of questions coming from many sources. This first question is for Professor Mearsheimer. So we have information that on March 23rd of this year, $580 million worth of oil futures were dumped. They were dumped in 1 minute. And that was exactly 15 minutes before Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States was in productive conversations with Iran. And that, of course, sent oil prices tumbling and made some people very wealthy or very much wealthier, however you want to look at it. And then for the second time in days, Trump paused strikes on Iran, again saying we will give a 10-day pause to continue negotiations when the 10-year Treasury yield crossed 4.4%, and the no man's land is 4.5%, where the U.S. is desperately worried that the economy will really fail. And this is kind of suggesting that war and peace decisions are timed to the financial market, and maybe that this war is a financial instrument, which is really, really dark, and it could just be an underlying thread to all of the other really dark aspects of this war. But do you see this as sort of a default end to American foreign policy, that it's really war profiteering?
Well, there's a number of issues here. First of all, the business of yields on 10-year Treasury bonds, I've been watching that very carefully. And as you pointed out, it's up over 4.4% now. And before the war started, it was below 4%. And this is very worrisome, right? This is just more evidence that that iceberg is sitting out there. So those kinds of considerations matter enormously. Now let's go back to Monday, the 23rd, when Trump made this announcement. A lot of people argued that he made the announcement because he understood the markets were opening that morning and he didn't want the markets to plunge and oil prices to skyrocket and so forth and so on. I actually think that was part of the explanation. I think the real reason was he understood the iceberg is out there. And he had promised that he was going to attack that night. That was the issue. Remember, he called off the attack that morning. And that, of course, affected the markets. There's no question about that. But much more importantly, it meant we weren't going to attack that night. And attacking that night would have been a colossal blunder, a colossal blunder, just like attacking 10 days from now would be a colossal blunder. So I think the main reason he did that was not because he was concerned so much about the markets, but because he understood he was staring the abyss in the face. Now, with regard to these people who made money, this is hardly surprising. Uh, I'm an old dog. I've been around for a long time. I have never seen a regime in the United States that comes even close to being as corrupt as the Trump regime. So I would find it hardly surprising if we eventually discover that some people in the Trump administration took advantage of this announcement to make money. But I think, to be honest, I don't want to make light of it because it does indicate how corrupt the country has become. But at the same time, I think this is small change. Again, I think the really big issue here is the iceberg.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to cluster a few questions together, and then perhaps Trita, if you could maybe just answer whichever one you're most comfortable with. So people are asking about NATO, how this war will impact NATO. Will NATO be able to survive the fractures between European allies and the US? Also, are Israel and the US correct in saying that a nuclear Iran does pose an existential threat to them? If that comes to pass, maybe if one of those two, if Trita, you'd like to address.
So I think John may know more about, or I know he knows way more about NATO than I do. Let me just say one thing on NATO is that the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has been one of those European leaders who have been blatantly in support of this war from the outset and continues to be, and excuses it and says that this, international law doesn't matter in these issues, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that that is reflective of most European countries, even though many of them, unfortunately, have taken a disgraceful position publicly. Privately, many of them actually have lobbied to end the war, but it's just another example of how unprincipled and weak the Europeans have become, so that even when they do the right thing, they want to pretend that they're doing the wrong thing for their political reasons and their relationship with Trump. On the other issue of an existential threat, the Iranians do not have the ability to reach the United States with their missiles, and they don't have nuclear weapons. And if they were to have nuclear weapons, they would still not be able to deliver them onto the American soil, and they would not be able to do it in any other fashion, and we would know much more about that if they were to go in that direction. Moreover, they don't have a second strike capability, which the United States would do. So it would be completely suicidal for them to do something like that. From the Israeli standpoint, the Israelis do have not only nuclear weapons, they also have a second strike capability. The Germans have given them several Dolphin nuclear-equipped submarines. So even if the Iranians were to do something as foolish as use a nuclear weapon against Israel, the Israelis would still be able to retaliate against them, and it would be suicidal. So is it good for the US and Israel if this were to happen? I don't think so. But this kind of hysterical calling everything an existential threat. Remember, these missiles are an existential threat. At some point, kitchen knives in Iran will be deemed an existential threat by the Israelis. We have to be very careful because this is a rhetorical tool that is being used to mobilize the United States in favor of wars that do not serve US interest.
Dr. Parsi, I have a follow-up to that, which is also a collection from a lot of the Q&A that's been submitted, and that is, would it actually be good for the world if Iran were able to have nuclear weapons? Would it put a check on the unchecked warmongering of the United States and Israel?
I think John should come in on this one as well. He has studied, the ability of having that type of nuclear stability much more than I have. I would point out one thing though. When the United States and Russia were facing each other during the Cold War, it was essential to make sure that nuclear misunderstandings were evaded. So a red line, a hotline was established. The US and Russia did talk to each other on a regular basis, but a red hotline was established to make sure that very quickly the president could reach the leader of the Soviets. We don't have anything even remotely similar to that between Iran and Israel under those circumstances. So we have to take into account the risk of not, oh, what would the stability factor here be, but also the misunderstanding and miscalculation factor here that also would be very significant. So I think, in my view, it is a world that is much riskier than needs to be, because I think there are other paths. Prior to this war, the strategic thinking in Iran was that a nuclear weapon actually would be a strategic negative. I'm sure many, many of them regret it at this point. But their belief was that if they actually got a nuclear weapon and they risked fueling a nuclear arms race in the region, and other states, very small states like Bahrain, were to build or buy nuclear weapons, they would put themselves at parity with much smaller states and lose much of their conventional superiority. And as a result, the only scenario that would be worthwhile for them, and this goes back to the time of the Shah, to actually have a nuclear weapon and go in that direction, was if they face an existential threat that would have to come from one of the superpowers in the world. Now we are in that scenario. And where the Iranians will be on this, I suspect, will be very different from what it was prior to this war. But I want to hear John on this.
Yeah, let me make 3 quick points. First of all, I think if Iran and even a number of other Arab countries like Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, if they all had nuclear weapons, there's no question in my mind that the Middle East would be more peaceful because they're weapons of mass destruction and they make war, I'm choosing my words carefully here, much less likely. But as Trita was hinting, you can't rule out miscalculation. You can't rule out the possibility that they would be used. And even if the chance is only 1%, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to take that chance? I often use the analogy, if I have a gun and I come up to you and there are 100 chambers in the barrel and I put one bullet in one of the chambers, and then I spin the barrel and I put the gun up to your head and I say, don't worry, there's only a 1% chance I'm going to blow your head off. Are you going to be nervous? The answer is you're going to be extremely nervous, even though there's only a 1% chance. So it would be much better if nobody got nuclear weapons and if Israel got rid of its nuclear weapons. But I think the system, the Middle East system would be less stable without nuclear weapons. I think you have to understand that trade-off. Final point I would make is I think the greatest danger we face is that if Iran decides to get nuclear weapons, I believe that given that the Israelis have shown that they can't win a conventional war against Iran, the Israelis will be tempted to use their nuclear weapons to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. In many ways, I think that's the ultimate nightmare scenario at this point in time.
Just a quick question, a follow-up about that. We've been talking about nuclear weapons. Well, Pakistan does have nuclear weapons, and Pakistan has signed a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. In the midst of all this, do you think that Pakistan might get involved and would extend its nuclear umbrella? Whatever that means. How would that manifest? But do you think there are chances of Pakistan getting involved as this conflict escalates?
Well, I think the really key question here is whether or not Pakistan would use its nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia
Right.
in the crunch. This was the same question we faced in the Cold War. Would we use nuclear weapons to defend West Germany? And today the question is, would we use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea and Japan? I think with regard to Pakistan, it would not use nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia or any other country for that matter, because you would risk your own destruction. So I think this would give the Saudis very powerful incentives to get nuclear weapons of their own if Iran were to get nuclear weapons. And the Saudis have effectively said that. And of course, this is why the United States goes to such great lengths to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, because we understand that that will give the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Turks, and so forth and so on their own incentive to get nuclear weapons. And then we'll have proliferation, which is in a very important way a nightmare scenario for the reasons that I explained before. But the great paradox here is that by starting this war, what we did was increase the chances that we're going to run into this nightmare scenario.
Trita, do you want to just give some last comments? Because I know we are running over our time and we would love to have this go on for another hour. But we're very mindful of your time as well, both of you. And so just if you have any concluding comments, because I know then Roxanne will wrap up.
If I could just say one thing, we are not all just spectators in this terrible, terrible reality show that we have involuntarily ended up in. I do think that it's very important for members of the community to make phone calls to their members of Congress, particularly if you live in a Republican district, and make very clear how opposed you are not only to the continuation of the war, but particularly ground troops, Congress setting aside $200 billion in a supplemental for this war. This affects all of us. And the administration, just as much as John correctly pointed out, this big iceberg of the economy, but that is also then going to be translated into pressure from the public on members of Congress. And the White House needs to hear from a lot of Republican members of Congress that this is a nightmare for them because this is going to cost them the elections in November, and that this is an important issue. Until those pressures get much, much stronger than what they are today, Trump will believe that he still has a lot of space to continue the war in the hope of that silver bullet that I mentioned earlier on.
Absolutely. That's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much. Roxanne, over to you.
Oh, we just want to thank you, Professor Mearsheimer and Dr. Parsi, and we want to thank our co-sponsors, Code Pink and Massachusetts Peace Action and Connecticut Palestine Alliance, and everyone who watched this evening. We will be sending out the link to the recording. We will be sending out the chat transcript, and we will just encourage everyone to do as Dr. Parsi mentioned and make your voice heard with your members of Congress and vote this year. So thank you all very, very much for your time.
Thank you,
Thank you
Professor.
so much.
Thank you, Dr.
You're more than welcome. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Likewise. Thank
so
you.
much. Take care. Thank you for your insights.